Chapter 20. Crisis of Caution. Year 0002, August 9th. With utmost care, Aerith crept down the stairs of the main room of her house. She knew every loose floorboard, every creaky stair in the house now, knew exactly where to set her step to avoid detection, and it was both saddening and heartening how easily she made it to the ground floor. She maneuvered between the army of flower pots she'd left there in preparation for starting some of her autumn flowers growing. The seed packets were laid out on the table, waiting for morning. Aerith gave a soft gasp as the end of her staff nudged a ceramic pot, making it rock and clatter lightly against its brethren. Tense, frozen in place, with her hands clenched around her weapon, she waited and listened hard. There came no sound from above. The door of her mother's room had squeaky hinges, and at last she relaxed. Releasing the breath she'd been holding, she slipped over to the door, eased it open, and backed out of the house. Looking up at the high gables of the home she'd grown up in, Aerith released a small, guilty sigh. Her mother worried so, and if she knew Aerith was sneaking out to practice her staff forms... "Sorry, Mom, but I have to do this." Firming her resolve against the guilt, Aerith sucked in a steadying breath. No matter what, she had to see this through. She didn't want to rely on Zack and Cloud's protection. What she wanted was to be able to stand for herself and with them. She'd hidden long enough. The wind had been whispering to her lately. On the soft breeze came tales of foreboding and promises of peace, fables of things long past and premonitions for the future. Aerith didn't understand it completely, though a part of her heart wanted to follow the call, to soar with it and see what lay beyond Midgar's walls. But the rest of her was just so frustrated. She thought they would have told her by now, with how many times she'd told them that she wanted to help them, that she was there for them. Zack had even promised, and for a time she'd been content to wait. Maybe it was foolish of her to be upset with their persistent exclusion of her. Maybe she ought to trust them and their reasons, but she couldn't help her irritation. With a huff, she whirled away from the door, skirt fluttering around her calves. She was brought up short by the sight of a black-suited figure she hadn't noticed before standing in her garden. With her heart thundering in her chest, she took in the pale colour of the stranger's appearance. She would have thought it were Cloud, if not for how tamed his hair was, the lack of solemnity about him, and the stylish suit. Aerith couldn't imagine Cloud in clothes like these. The very thought made her want to laugh. She hadn't seen him in anything but his uniform since she'd met him. The brief spike of amusement disappeared quickly beneath the frigid fright that came in its wake. I know that uniform. Despite how quiet she'd been, her appearance didn't go unnoticed. The Turk turned towards her, and Aerith took half a step back. Her back knocked against the door, the knob pressing into her spine, and just like that, the frustration and stubbornness came surging back. Standing tall, she clutched her staff more tightly and asked, "Can I help you?" The warm smile she received in answer only made the Turk's boyish good looks more handsome. He really did look like Cloud, but his smile reminded Aerith more of Zack.
"I'm sorry to intrude, miss,"
he said.
"I'm afraid I was lost and noticed the garden. I was quite taken by the flowers. Are they yours?"
She nodded slowly. "I planted them, yes." The smile never left his face as he turned his gaze over the garden again.
"I commend your ability to grow them. I haven't seen such beauty since the last time I was outside of Midgar."
His eyes settled back on her disconcertingly as he spoke. It was a gaze that made her fear of Shinra rise up again, catching in her throat and making her pulse race. "Thank you, but it really doesn't take much," Aerith said quietly. She hoped she didn't sound as choked as she felt. Just a little care and water. The Turk laughed, voice light and bright in the twilight.
Don't belittle your achievement, miss. It's refreshing to see this kind of oasis in the city. Reminds me of home. I grew up far away from Midgar, you see.
Curious in spite of herself, she searched his face, blurred by the shadows as it was. Though he didn't seem threatening, she refused to let herself relax. Tseng never seemed threatening either, and she'd never been fooled by him.
I've never been outside of Midgar,
she admitted, but I plan to one day. Soon she would, with Zack like he promised. It wasn't a promise he'd made to her anymore. It was a promise she'd made to herself.
During the warm months, you can find some rare flowers in the crags around Icicle area,
he said. He shifted his grip on the pair of sticks he had under one arm.
You should be sure to visit.
I'll keep that in mind, she muttered. She glanced back over her shoulder, briefly, before looking back at the Turk. Courage or no, frustration or not, it was clear that the Turk had little interest in leaving. Gathering a quick breath to bolster herself once more, she nodded to him. If you'll excuse me, I really should be on my way.
Ah, miss,
he called after her as she turned and began to walk away. Aerith's heart stuttered in her chest, and her lungs seemed to freeze with a sudden flash of terror. A hot flush went through her in its wake, burning it away and leaving anger in its place. Her hands tightened on her staff. If he tried anything, she was prepared to defend herself.
Please, what are you doing out so late? It's not safe for a young woman to be wandering around the streets alone at night.
As if to give credence to his words, a sudden shout broke the relative quiet.
There she is! That's the girl!
Her heart jumped into her throat. Had the Turks brought back up? If they really wanted to take her by force, she'd stand little chance. But that didn't mean she wouldn't make it hard for them. She turned and brought her staff up defensively. The pair of men approaching weren't dressed in the distinctive Turk suit, nor were they in the bright blue of Shinra's army. Instead, they wore drab brown fatigues. At least she wasn't going to be cornered between a Turk and more of Shinra's people. The sound of footsteps had her whirling back towards the Turk, staff poised to strike. His face had shifted from friendly to deadly serious. The two men came to an abrupt halt, a startled oath hanging in the air between them. One of the men brought his rifle up, aiming it towards the Turk.
Can I help you, gentlemen?
The Turk asked pleasantly. There was a soft clink of chain as he shifted. Then, with a neat twirl, the Turk unfolded what Aerith had mistaken for simple sticks into a set of nunchucks. He draped them idly about his neck, hands grasping at the ends of the sticks. He looked relaxed, yet threatening at the same time.
This isn't any of your business, Turk. This is between us and the girl. Leave,
the man with the rifle growled.
Ah,
the Turk said with an air of understanding.
Therein lies our problem. You see, she's with me.
Aerith nearly jumped right out of her skin as a warm hand curled around her waist and tugged her closer to his side. She tried to jerk away from him automatically, and his grip tightened just enough to prevent her escape. He turned towards her, smiling brightly, before casting an arched look at the pair.
If you'll excuse us, we must be going.
Aerith let herself be tugged forward as she cast a glance back towards the house. The last thing she wanted was to have her mother dragged into this.
I don't think so, Turk.
The sharp words were the only warning they had as they made to walk past the two. A hand shot out towards Aerith, and she reacted without thought. Ducking down, she brought her staff up to give the man a sharp rap against the ribs, twisted around, and landed a ringing blow against the side of his head. She let out a harsh breath as he hit the ground on his knees with a groan of pain. It had been automatic. the phantom feel of Zach's hands sliding along her arms to press her elbows into the right position, his voice low in her ear as he coaxed her through the passes. Cloud had always been content to sit on a pew and watch them, or act as the enemy for her to practice on. Nearby, the other man collapsed from a swarm of blows landed by the Turk, who proceeded to catch his weapon under one arm. He held his hand out to her in invitation, and after a moment of hesitation, she took it. "They'll follow us, right?" she asked, voice low as they trotted down the pathway towards the Sector 5 marketplace. "They won't go after my mom, will they?"
"Worry about yourself for the moment, miss,"
the Turk said pleasantly. He stopped and peered into the gloom ahead of them, before ducking down a small side path. The narrow alley led into the twisted avenues littering the space between her home and the church.
"First things first, we have to get you away from them."
They'd run only a little further when he drew her behind him and pressed her back into a shadowed niche. The sound of tramping boots heralded more men approaching. Aerith crouched among the detritus, ignoring the piece of scrap metal digging into her back. She braced a hand on the Turk's shoulder and peered around him to watch the men pass by. After several seconds of silence, Aerith leaned close to whisper, "Are they gone?" The Turk turned his head and smiled at her. This close, she saw that his eyes were blue, though they didn't have the same quality that Zach and Cloud's did. They were darker, and not as startlingly noticeable.
"Yes, miss,"
he said warmly.
"It might be best to wait a moment more."
She nodded and settled back. As time stretched and the quiet filled with their soft breathing, her nerves frayed more and more.
"Miss?"
Aerith glanced over and met the Turk's gaze again.
"Do you know why they're after you?"
Aerith looked down at her hand, where it clutched around the middle of her staff. It was possible these men wanted her for the same reason the Turks had always pursued her, but glancing at this Turk through her lashes, she couldn't help but wonder. "He doesn't seem to know who I am." Softly, she said, "No, it wasn't a lie. I've never seen them before. Who are they?" The Turk shot her another brief glance before leaning forward to peer out of their hideaway.
"They're part of an anti-Shinra group. It seems odd for them to be targeting you for no reason."
Aerith shrugged uncomfortably, though he couldn't see it. There was only one reason she could imagine anyone targeting her, and that was because of what she was. Unless, what if it's because I'm close to people in Shinra? Her heart began to pound. Had she become a target because of Zack and Cloud? Were they important enough for people who hated Shinra to try to use her against them? Was this what they had feared? What had kept them silent? Were they worried that she was a liability? Aerith pressed a knuckle against her lips in thought. Even if that were true, she was still tired of their reticence. If they told her, then she could have been sure now. Maybe she could have done something more, been more prepared. Aerith sucked in a sharp breath and forced herself to release the anger. There was nothing for it now. She could be properly angry later. A hand gripped hers and pulled her to her feet.
"Maybe that's it then,"
the Turk murmured, voice cast low as he led the way across the road at a crouch. They were back among the winding avenues of Midgar's cast-offs in a heartbeat.
"Are they very important?"
At the end of the lane, he drew up and squatted down to peek around the pile of scrap beside them. Aerith nearly lost her balance and caught herself against the dirt. "Zack's a soldier, first class," she answered. "And Cloud is—" Aerith frowned slightly. What was Cloud? He wasn't a soldier, even if he felt like one, but he wasn't exactly normal. "Cloud is Zack's friend," she said at last. "They work together, partners." It was the only way she could really describe their relationship. There was a sense about them, an air, as if they'd known each other all their lives. Other than a few spats now and then, they melded together so well, it was hard to remember that Cloud had only really entered their lives a short while ago. It was like he'd always been there. Cloud with his strangely odd and worn soul that had a voice that whispered to her of dark potence. The Turk gave a thoughtful hum and ducked back. At Aerith's questioning glance, he held up a finger to his lips for quiet. A scuff sounded, giving away a heavier footstep as someone approached.
"They can't have gone far,"
A voice grumbled.
"Peterson said they came this way."
A pair of shadows fell across their hiding place, darkening it further, before the duo beyond passed by. The Turk leaned in close and whispered,
"When I say move, hurry."
His hand sneaked over his shoulder to point, and she followed the line of his arm. Aerith nodded sharply and shifted her position to make ready. The Turk peered around the scrap, then motioned for her to go. Aerith darted forward immediately, ducking to move under the overhang of debris. A sharp yank on the back of her head had her turning. A sheared-off metal rod had caught on her ribbon and pulled it free. As her materia hit the pavement with a musical chime, the toe of her boot caught on a jagged crack. Aerith went down hard, with a small sound of surprise and pain. Her staff clattered against the cement, rolling a few inches away.
"There they are!"
The shout sounded strange and over-loud after the silence. Aerith shoved herself up on one arm and twisted around. Her ribbon trailed from the metal pipe it had snagged on, but there was no sign of the precious materia she kept tied up in her hair. One a memento of her mother, the other a gift from Zack, and the ribbon he had given her that meant just as much. She couldn't lose any of them. Aerith rolled onto her knees, palms and knuckles scraping against the dirty concrete as she searched for them feverishly. Nearby she could hear the rush and whirl of the Turk's weapons, the rattle of the chain holding the sticks together, and the heavy thwack of them hitting his opponents. She could hear harsh breaths as well, but was unable to discern if they were her own or the combatants'. Aerith bit her lip, unable to stop the tightness in her chest or the faint prick at the corner of her eyes. Just as her fingers closed around a small, cool sphere, a pair of scuffed shoes came into her peripheral vision. Aerith lashed out as a pair of hands grabbed her upper arms and hauled her up. Her elbow caught her assailant in the stomach, and she stepped down hard on their foot. Released suddenly, she staggered forward and grabbed up her staff. She whirled around and came face to face with the Turk. He backed away a step, hands held up in surrender.
"Miss," he said, "we need to go."
"But my—" she protested, voice thick. She turned, scanning the ground once more.
"There are more on the way,"
the Turk said, voice becoming harried.
"We must hurry."
The heavy tramp of multiple boots left her no choice. She took a last look around, then nodded. All that caught her gaze was the forlorn flutter of her abandoned ribbon. The memory still lingered, Zack's hands firm and gentle as he tied it into place, the smell of leather from his gloves and harness, and his voice as warm as his easy smile. So many important memories tied up in such insignificant objects. A silly pink ribbon, a materia that didn't work, and... As she ran, Aerith looked down at the hand clenched around the small crystal sphere and peeked through her fingers. The cool green glow of the cure materia winked back at her. Zack had been laying on the floor of the church when he'd given it to her. The stained glass windows had spilled a variety of colours over him and his sword beside him. It had been peaceful, soft and sweet. One of the little moments she'd come to cherish so much. Just spending time with him. That's all she wanted.
"Hey,"
he'd said, and she glanced over her shoulder at him from where she was crouched among the flowers, the little song she was humming trailing off as she waited. Zack had crooked his fingers at her and beckoned.
Come here. I've got a present for you.
Aerith had eased over to his side, and Zack had pulled her down to lay with him, his arm cradling her shoulder. With his other hand, he'd rummaged through his pockets until he'd found what he sought, and held it aloft with a triumphant, "Aha!" She'd been fascinated by the way light had glittered off the materia as it rested snugly between his thumb and forefinger, bright against the black leather. And its voice, so soft and sweet and immature compared to the age-old drone that she sometimes caught from her mother's memento. She tightened her grasp on the materia again as they ducked down another winding side path. It surged in answer, sweet and soothing, like the happy murmurs of her growing flowers, and she took heart in it. As soon as she was safe, she would go back and search for her lost memento and her ribbon. Hopefully, no one would have found and taken them. She had nothing else of her mother's left but that materia and the occasional soft whisper from the life stream. The Turk came to a halt so suddenly that she nearly ran by him. He grabbed her coat and pulled her back with him until her back touched the cool surface of a tin wall.
"Are you all right, miss?"
he asked. Aerith took a moment to regain her breath, unwilling to meet his gaze. She focused on the staff still clutched in one of her hands, the dirt smeared on her knuckles. She expected that her arms and skirt weren't much better. Setting her expression, she carefully slotted the little green sphere in her hand into one of the openings on her staff, where it would be safe. She preferred a more hands-on approach with materia, but for now, this would do. "I'm fine," she said after another deep breath. "It's only my ribbon, and I lost my memento. They're both precious gifts from people." The Turk frowned, eyes tracking across their surroundings thoughtfully. After a moment, he breathed out through his nose and gave a short nod. Aerith had a feeling he'd come to a decision.
"We should get you somewhere you can hide, miss. Then—"
Releasing a pent-up breath, Aerith interrupted. "My name isn't Miss, it's Aerith. Miss this, Miss that. It's cute enough when Cloud's girls call me Miss Aerith, but this—" She'd settle for Miss Aerith, but it was unsettling to be just Miss. It felt too distant, and between the girls, Zack, and even Cloud, Aerith didn't quite think herself up to such formality. Everyone always called her Aerith, and she liked it that way. She wasn't the sum of her gender or her bloodline. She was just Aerith. Zack looked at her like she was the world, like she was special all by herself, all without knowing anything of her past or her lineage. Cloud seemed to challenge her to be more, and that was exhilarating. But Zack's sweet, easy acceptance of her being whatever, whoever she wanted to be. Aerith didn't quite think there was anything like that. The Turk stared at her owlishly before his expression bloomed into a warm smile.
"Aerith,"
he echoed.
"A pretty name for a pretty miss."
His smile turned almost cheeky, and Aerith couldn't help but blush. Zack said things like that often, but she'd come to expect it from him, even if it still made her skin feel hot and her stomach fluttery. When she glanced back at the Turk, he offered, "Nunchuck." There was a slight jangle as he held up his weapon of choice, and she gave a weak, faint smile, but nodded her head in acceptance of the name regardless. His face turned serious for a moment.
"Once we find a place where you're safe, I will return to look for your treasures."
Aerith held her breath for a moment, warmed by the offer in spite of herself. "Thank you." Nunchuck nodded in easy acceptance.
"We should continue. Do you have any idea where we should go?"
His hand caught hers again, tugging her forward and back out into the street. The only sound Aerith heard was the distant yap of a dog and the occasional clatter of something falling. "Perhaps," she began, only to be cut off as she nearly ran into Nunchuck's back when he stopped abruptly.
"A Turk,"
a voice said flatly.
"You'll never learn, will you?"
She peered around Nunchuck to get a glimpse of what had stopped him. A man stood there, his hair concealed beneath a bandana. His gaze was as dark and fierce as the soul she could hear whispering inside him. The man's eyes flicked to her before landing back on the Turk.
"Oh well, I could use the fight. Never can work off the tension enough."
She didn't like the sound of that, nor did she like the sound of boots behind them. Aerith half turned to look back. Several men in the same brown uniform from before were now blocking their escape in that direction. Nunchuck released her and stepped forward with a twirl of his weapon.
"I suppose I have no choice but to accept your challenge,"
he said lightly.
"I'll not allow you to take her."
The man snorted.
"As if you pose a threat."
Faster than she could have expected, he rushed forward. Aerith couldn't quite stifle a gasp of surprise as he ducked under both a swing of Nunchuck's weapon and around the sharp kick that followed it. The man buried his fist in Nunchuck's stomach, bending him over his arm. Dark eyes gazed at her over the Turk's slumped shoulders as Nunchuck slipped limply to the side and hit the ground with a thump. He straightened slowly and looked down at her.
"It would be best,"
he said,
"if you come with me."
Despite the spike of fear she felt, Aerith stepped back to put some space between them and firmed her expression. The man glanced down at the staff she levelled at him, then back up at her as if he found her attempts paltry and lacking. Whether or not he did, Aerith refused to go down without a fight. Those days were behind her now. Midgar's night was never the all-encompassing darkness that Cloud had experienced in other towns. The ambient light from the Mako reactors, looming above the plates, cast their greenish glow against the forever overcast sky, creating a gloom that wasn't quite true night. Even down in the slums, amidst the ruins of the buildings and piles of refuse, discarded and left over the city Midgar used to be, the night seemed lit as if by a full moon, though the plates looming overhead still blocked out the sight of the grey clouds that blanketed the sky. Cloud slumped further against the wall he sat against, staring blankly against the deserted road at the half-finished buildings, as he had for the last few hours. The Seventh Heaven Bar was only a skeleton of a building, the construction having stalled out for the past few weeks. Outwardly, the foreman had complained loudly about the building materials going missing and the time it was taking for the replacements to come in. But Cloud suspected the missing materials were being put into use in the underground bunker that the bar would hide. It had been amusing for a while, watching the big man loudly berate and direct his workers, while every so often shooting Cloud a sideways look of paranoia. Cloud may have been a familiar face in the area, but he was still dressed as a Shinra trooper. He hadn't come down into the slums for any particular reason, despite ending up watching the construction for the last few hours before the men had gone home. Really, Cloud had been too lost in his own thoughts to notice much other than the gradual loss of light as the sun set. The sight of the bar taking shape pulled at his memories of quiet nights spent in Edge before he had let himself pull away from Tifa's welcoming smile. It left him feeling somewhat melancholic. Shifting again, he grimaced at the dull ache in his joints. They still twinged on occasion, though not to the extent of that icicle trip up to the bitterly cold northern continent. But sitting for hours unmoving, as he had caused them to once again stiffen up, and he regretted letting his mind wander for so long. Standing up slowly, he carefully worked the kinks out and regarded the deserted construction site again. All the workers had left long ago, so there was no one about to see his awkward movements. Once he felt more human, he pulled out his phone, noting the absence of any messages. Zack hadn't missed his company, at least, nor had any of the others who liked to seek him out on his off hours. He was glad he hadn't been up for company today. It was still early enough in the night that he didn't need to return plateside just yet. The last train didn't depart for another couple of hours, and really, if he was forced to spend the night in the church, it was hardly a hardship. Patrolling the slums around Sector 5 to shake up any lowlifes he came across would make things safer for Aerith as well. With steps that were only slightly stilted, he took off at a brisk trot, his stride smoothing out as the exercise worked out the last of his discomfort. He really disliked these little reminders of how young his body was. Zack had laughed about it, claiming he was just making up for missed life experiences. It was an experience he'd been perfectly happy with not remembering. Sector 7 passed by in a blur, and Cloud only snapped to attention when he made it to the monster-infested in-between. The creatures were more active at night, and it took him longer than normal to pass through to the Sector 6 park. He didn't stop, though he gave the slide a benign look. He could still remember Aerith's kind voice, helping him lift the burden of guilt he'd felt for moving on. It was funny how the play structure had been chosen by both Aeriths as an ideal place to talk. The broken road that led to Sector 5 was surprisingly deserted of monsters, which made him frown. Something had scared them off, or else he'd have whole eaters crawling all over him by now. He proceeded cautiously, which was the only reason he saw the man first, though it hardly mattered, as he was spotted in return barely a second later.
"Hey, you're not allowed down here,"
the man called, jerking his chin to send Cloud back the way he came.
"Since when?"
Cloud retorted quietly, taking a few more steps forward. In the gloom, it was hard to make out colors, but the uniform the man was wearing looked familiar.
"Since now,"
the man growled, bringing his rifle up to aim at Cloud's chest. Cloud didn't wait to see if he'd decide to shoot first, rather than repeat his demand. He dashed forward and was in front of the man in moments, knocking him backwards with a flat palm to the underside of his chin. The gun clattered as it fell from limp hands, and the man was unconscious before he even hit the ground. Glancing around to make sure the man had been alone, Cloud absently rubbed his wrist as he straightened up. What's going on now? Now that he could take a closer look, he did recognize the drably colored uniform of Avalanche. His stomach twisted, and he ducked his chin into his scarf to hide the scowl that crossed his face. These people's fanaticism made them as dangerous as Shinra was. After their last fiasco, he was becoming less and less fond of their antics. He couldn't say they twisted the name of Avalanche, since they held it first, but to him it felt like they had. Regardless, they were up to something in Sector 5, and he wasn't inclined to leave them to their own devices, especially not so close to Aerith's home. He took a moment to drag the unconscious guard off to the side and cast a sleep spell on him for added security. The gun was dropped unceremoniously on the man's chest, butt end first, before Cloud turned on his heel and headed further in. He kept his steps quiet as he moved quickly along the deserted streets, That was another sign of something amiss. Even in the late hour of the night, there was always someone hanging around the streets of the slums, even in the relatively nicer areas like Sector 5. A fluttering movement caught his eye, and Cloud turned towards it. Caught on a jutting strut at about head height was a familiar pink ribbon. The sudden rush of adrenaline, followed by an icy chill down his back, left him dizzy. As he jolted forward, heart pounding and unable to hear over the rushing sound in his ears, he stepped slowly as he neared the discarded hairpiece, reaching out to tug it gently free. Something knocked against his boot, and the dull gleam drew his gaze down to where Holy rolled against the uneven dirt. His knees hit the ground roughly as he scrambled for the precious materia, gloved hands scooping it out of the dust. Light glowed dully along the smooth edges, catching the occasional glint of white fire, and it appeared to be unharmed. It was, he realized numbly, the first time he'd ever seen the materia close up. The only time he'd seen it before had been at Aerith's death. Anger swept through him, hot and choking. In his hand, the ribbon creased as his fist tightened, fine tremors running up his arm as he tried to rein in the desire to just start destroying buildings until someone told him what happened to Aerith. She was supposed to be safe at home right now, not lost in the streets with dangerous men running around. He swept a burning gaze around the area. There was no blood on the ribbon, no sign of a struggle nearby, and he hoped that meant Aerith was well where she was. If she wasn't... He lurched noisily to his feet, with fingers that still shook slightly. He smoothed the ribbon out before tucking it and Holy gently into his pocket. The leather of his glove creaked as he drew his sword out, the blade rock steady in his grip. He took a brief moment to pull out his phone and tap out a message. Aerith's in trouble. That duty done, he took off in search of someone to question. It wasn't long before a commotion caught his attention. He strained his ears and caught a few short, cut-off screams. It sounded like it was coming from the next street over, so rather than run around looking for a way to cut across, he leapt high into the air, landing near silently on the rooftop. He ran to the other end, keeping low so as not to be noticed by anyone on the ground. When he cautiously peered over, he saw a single Avalanche member standing guard outside an open doorway. Through the windows, a family huddled in one corner, unharmed from what he could tell, and in another room, another Avalanche member was methodically searching the house. That was a relief, though it didn't do much against his simmering anger. If they were still searching so frantically, perhaps they hadn't caught Aerith yet. There was one way to find out for sure if she was their target this night. Cloud tucked his sword away, freeing up his hands. Judging the distance, he took a few steps back, then ran forward and leapt. He landed just behind the Avalanche member standing guard, and before the man could do more than realize his presence, Cloud grabbed him and jumped again, taking his unwilling prisoner with him. He kept a hand firmly over the man's mouth, while the other wrapped around his chest and wrist, keeping him from reaching the trigger on his gun. The landing was less graceful thanks to his squirming prisoner, but Cloud was confident the maneuver hadn't been noticed. There was no immediate outcry at least. He took a few extra steps away from the edge, just to be sure they couldn't be seen, before turning his attention to his victim. Thanks to their difference in height, the man was forced to bend backwards as Cloud kept his own feet firmly on the ground. It helped keep the man off balance, giving him no leverage to fight against Cloud's greater strength. Aware of the muffled groans, Cloud hissed in the man's ear,
"If you continue to make those noises, I'll rip your tongue out."
Extreme, but the man didn't know Cloud was bluffing. Mostly. It did the trick, as the man cut off mid-sound and stood trembling in Cloud's grasp.
"I will give you one chance,"
Cloud continued quietly, menacingly.
"Tell me who your target is. If anything else comes out of your mouth, I'll follow through."
He removed his hand from the man's mouth, not letting up on his grip to keep him still.
"The girl! The ancient!"
He blurted out.
"Where is she?"
Cloud snapped, giving the man a hard shake.
"I don't know!"
He gasped, then abruptly sagged as Cloud immediately cast a sleep spell on him. That settled that. He didn't care for anything else the man might know. He let the man slip onto the roof with a soft thud and stepped over him to peer over the edge of the roof again. No one was in the street below, and the house the other Avalanche member had been in was now dark and silent. Whether he was laying low or had moved on without his companion, Cloud wasn't sure. But it didn't matter. The dust of the road stirred only slightly as he leapt down onto the street, taking off at a quick trot. Now he had to find Aerith before Avalanche did. Over the quiet sound of his own breathing, he could hear more distant noises of other Avalanche members searching. He stayed clear of the nearest ones, more interested in finding Aerith. It wasn't long, however, before he came across a body in the street. A body wearing a familiar, dark suit. Turk. If Aerith's shadow had been taken out. None too gently, Cloud towed the Turk in his back. He was fair-haired and unfamiliar, not one of the Turks Cloud had run into before. And he was alive, as he was groaning in pain from the rough treatment. His eyes fluttered open a moment later, and he jerked back as he met Cloud's angry stare.
"Where's Aerith?"
Cloud demanded, not willing to wait to give him a chance to recover.
"Ah,"
the Turk said, sounding muzzy.
"You must be one of the friends she mentioned."
Cloud's eyes narrowed. So the Turks had been with Aerith.
"You didn't protect her."
It wasn't a question.
"I did try, but I appeared to have gotten in a little over my head."
The Turk rolled over and shoved himself to his feet before dusting off his pants and sleeves.
"You know how these things go."
Cloud growled, unappreciative of the man's joviality.
"Come on."
He didn't wait for a reply, stalking off further down the road. He'd make sure the Turk took responsibility for failing in this duty. He heard the faint sound of a clinking chain and soft shush of footsteps following after him.
"Yes, we had best find Miss Aerith."
Cloud glanced over his shoulder, then had to restrain himself from smacking the bright smile off the Turk's face. Right now, he had to focus on making sure Aerith was safe. Then he could see how well the Turk could take a punch. The Turk had Aerith's staff held loosely in one hand. Cloud hadn't noticed it, but it must have been lying nearby if this was where they had snatched Aerith. A sensation just on the edge of his awareness made Cloud pause. For a moment, he felt as if he were on the verge of a waking dream, that he'd felt the soft presence of Aerith at his back. But it was different than that. Less familiar, more incomprehensible. On a hunch, he dug into his pocket and pulled out wholly, Aerith's ribbon trailing along as it tangled in his fingers. Was he imagining things, or was there a faint glow in the infinite depth of the materia? Was it reacting to its mistress's distress?
Oh,
The Turk leaned towards him, blue eyes lighting up.
is that Miss Aerith's precious items? She'll be pleased that you found them. I'd meant to go back once she was safe, but...
Cloud closed his glove around Holy, cutting it off from view as he shoved it back in his pocket. He was doubly glad that he'd been the one to find it. Just the thought of someone from Shinra getting their hands on Holy, no matter if they knew its worth or not, sent shivers down his spine. He wasn't going to let go of the precious materia except to Aerith's own hands, once she was safe.
The church,
he muttered. They had to backtrack a ways to a side street that would take them to the building. Maybe it had just been in his head, but Holy meant Aerith, and for him the church meant Aerith as well. He had no other leads short of shaking down every Avalanche member they could find, and by then they could spirit Aerith off. Trotting gamely along, the Turk gave Cloud a sidelong glance that Cloud ignored. It didn't stop the Turk from asking,
do you know why Avalanche is after Miss Aerith?
Cloud didn't break his stride as he trotted down an alley, shoulders brushing against the close side of the ramshackle buildings on either side.
Yes,
he replied shortly. If the Turk wanted to play dumb, he wasn't going to get any information from Cloud.
Are you Zack or Cloud?
The Turk asked.
Is the other one here as well? We may need backup. Zack is on his way.
Cloud snapped.
We won't need any backup. If you say so. Just be aware that one of Avalanche's leaders is out here, at the very least.
The Turk looked Cloud's trooper uniform up and down, his expression turning doubtful. Cloud ducked his chin in his scarf, with a frown at the unwanted scrutiny. News of his refusal of the soldier position had trickled down into the ranks. Some of the other soldiers, Gibbs and Edge in the lead, had questioned his sanity at not taking it. Whatever the Turk was thinking had to wait. Turning a final corner, Cloud saw 4 Avalanche members standing guard on the steps to the church. By their attentive stance and how they immediately turned their guns on him, he guessed his hunch had been correct, so far as they were using the building as a home base. Adjusting his grip on his sword handle, he charged forward just as the first shots went off. One glanced off the pommel of his sword. A few more he deflected with the blade, until he was in the middle of the men. With a backflip Tifa always favored, he kicked one of the members under the chin, sending him flying up and backwards. As soon as his boots touched the ground, he shoved off and struck another man in the stomach with the pommel of his sword, hearing his breath leave him in a whoosh as he doubled over Cloud's arm. A further shove sent the man sprawling and freed Cloud to bring his sword around at the third member, cleaving his gun in half just above the trigger and narrowly missing taking some of the man's fingers with it. Cloud didn't give the gaping man a chance to recover as he punched him in the face with the fist holding the sword, sending him down just as easily as the other 2. A thump behind him had Cloud turning, ready to take care of the last of them, but it was unnecessary. The Turk, wielding a pair of nunchucks, casually completed a spin of the weapon before tucking them under his arms. The Avalanche member in front of him appeared frozen for a moment, before his eyes rolled into his head, and he collapsed to the ground.
Shall we?
The Turk asked, waving towards the doors. Cloud was already moving. The anger that had been simmering since he'd found Aerith's ribbon was boiling over. Not only had they hounded his precious friend, but they had defiled her church, a place that meant as much to him as it did to her. Sorry, Aerith, I'm going to get a little rough. The doors to the church exploded inward, victim of the sharp kick Cloud had levelled against them. Taking clear off their hinges, one cartwheeled into the nearest pew, the other flipping slowly through the air to crash off to the side. He'd fix them later. Cloud's first glimpse of the interior was to see an unknown man yank Aerith behind him as he whirled to face the doors. Further behind the two stood another man and a woman who held a sword casually in her grip.
Who the hell?
The first man began, only to be cut off as he went flying backwards into a wall as Cloud slammed him away from Aerith. Immediate threat gone, he turned to her, taking in the livid bruise across her cheek and her wide, frightened eyes.
Are you okay, Aerith?
He asked quietly, wincing in sympathy as he brought a gloved hand up to carefully brush her injured cheek. She smiled at him, the fear slowly clearing from her expression.
I'd be better if I had my staff back.
Her gaze drifted over his shoulder at the sound of quiet footsteps coming towards them.
Nunchuck, I'm glad you're all right. You as well, Miss Aerith.
The Turk stopped beside them and offered Aerith her staff.
Here you are.
Thank you, she said gratefully, gripping it tightly for a moment before relaxing into a more ready stance.
Excuse me.
A quiet but firm voice cut in. The one Cloud had attacked had pulled himself out of the hole, something else to repair, and was glaring at Cloud with murder in his eyes. Cloud was mildly impressed he could still stand. Was he a raven as well? His armor wasn't the dirty black that Cloud remembered, that Zack said it changed into. He was skilled, though, if he could take a hit like that from Cloud and come back for more.
We have business with the Ancient,
the woman said, her sword at the ready at her side.
Please leave.
Before Cloud could respond to the woman's demand, Nunchuck blurted out,
Ancient?
Effectively derailing his thoughts. Cloud wondered if it was somehow possible for Nunchuck to not know who Aerith was. Cloud had assumed he'd been guarding her for the night. Possibly he owed the Turk an apology too.
Let's just take them out.
The man wearing the green bandana, the one Cloud had hit, growled.
He's Shinra, and he brought that Turk with him. Look at those eyes.
A silky voice interjected. Cloud looked to the other man and felt an immediate twinge of revulsion. There was something about his eyes and the way they stared calculatingly, hungrily at Cloud, that put him off.
He has Mako eyes. I'll take care of him.
The woman sounded confident, he noticed warily.
You two should get the Ancient away so that we can finish this conversation. Alfie, no. Let me handle it. I can take him.
The man protested, jabbing a finger in Cloud's direction.
And I'm not going anywhere,
Aerith said, voice rising sharply. She backed up beside Cloud, bracketing him between her and the Turk, and brandished her staff at the trio.
I already told you I can't help you.
A creak of train and wood sounded at Cloud's other side.
You'll have to get through me as well,
Nunchuck said pleasantly. That did make things easier, as much as Cloud hated to admit it. It looked like, once again, he'd have to reluctantly ally himself with the Turks. Tilting his chin up in challenge, Cloud met the woman's eyes. They didn't hold the telltale glow of Mako, but something about her exuded strength that he'd best be wary of.
Your conversation is over. You leave.
The man in the bandana was the first to move, charging forward with his fists raised. Nunchuck leapt forward to engage him, and Cloud let it be when he saw the woman move as well. She was fast, but he was faster, and was on her first, blade swinging. To his surprise, she blocked him. Blocked, and held him off, rather than being thrown backwards as he'd intended. The shock wave of their blades meeting ruffled his clothes. Her eyes flicked calmly to his.
"Your power is like his,"
she said, seemingly unbothered by the strain of holding up against him. His brow wrinkled in confusion. Whose power was she talking about? Only one person came to mind, but that meant she'd faced Sephiroth before and lived. It was frustrating not to know if it was because of the holes in his memory or if it was a hushed secret of Shinra. Wouldn't it make sense to send their best against Avalanche's leader at some point? He gave himself a mental shake. There was no time to dwell on that now, if it mattered at all. Shoving on their locked blades, Cloud managed to get enough leverage to break away. He didn't wait and charged in with a series of quick slashes, hoping to catch her off guard. None got through her defense, their swords ringing a constant melody of attack and parry as he tried to find an opening. It was strange. She wasn't as fast as a soldier, yet somehow she was always where his blade was next. She shouldn't be so strong, but she met him blow for blow and didn't give an inch. The second man's voice broke his concentration, and Cloud nearly got a sword through his arm for the distraction. He was talking to Aerith, and Cloud could hear the sounds of Nunchuck and the other man's battle up in the eaves of the church.
"Please, come with me."
The man held a gun in one hand, low at his side. Aerith kept her staff trained on him, face twisted in a determined and ferocious expression.
"I really would like you to hear us out." "I don't know where the Promised Land is."
As they locked blades again, Cloud glanced over his shoulder at the woman. That was why they were hounding Aerith? Just as Shinra did. This avalanche strived for something they had no understanding of, and he didn't doubt they'd be just as tenacious in trying for Aerith's help, willing or not. He wanted so badly to tell them that their mythical land of endless pools of Mako was just that, a dream, a concept, something not in this world. There was no way they could touch it. Even Aerith, for all that her blood let her hear the planet's voice, hadn't been able to reach it, except in death. There was no Promised Land to exploit. He couldn't, though. Swallowing back the words and bile, he shoved hard, then lashed out a boot to catch the woman in the stomach and send her stumbling back a few steps. The anger was back, just as hot, and now it was tinged with bitterness and hatred.
"You're a fool,"
he said softly, raising his sword in front of him challengingly.
"You condemn something you know nothing about very easily,"
she retorted calmly. Shaking his head, Cloud replied,
"You're wrong." "Am I?"
the woman said, her head tilted slightly, and she gave him a once-over. In battle, her gaze had sharpened, focused.
"You seem certain of your reason to fight."
Cloud closed the distance between them again, the two combatants clashing and separating as he spoke.
"You fight for things you don't understand."
Another thrust, which she deflected just enough to miss her side, and he whipped his sword around, matched again.
"You hurt innocent people in your delusions, striving for a goal that can't be reached."
Another thrust, another parry. Cloud cast a fire spell at her, which she blocked, the flames singeing the old wooden floors.
"You struggle against a power that will fall anyway."
Vaguely, Cloud was aware of the commotion above him from Nunchuck and his opponent, and the sucking silence coming from the other side of the church where Aerith still stood. Part of him was aware he was saying too much, but the bitterness of what Avalanche was, the melancholic feeling that had been with him through the day, kept him talking.
"And the sad thing is, you fail.
he said, feeling a touch of pity for this woman who knew nothing of what was to come. He didn't know what happened to her, and that was the point, wasn't it?
You fail and have forgotten.
His next swing made her stumble back, or perhaps it was a reaction to his words. He stepped back, staring at her blankly as he lowered his sword.
Not even a memory.
She stared at him, eyes wide and baffled, her gaze searching his.
Who are you?
A yell and a body landing in the flower bed interrupted them, Nunchuck groaning amid the bobbing flower heads. The man with the bandana dropped down and used the pillar to slow his descent. He landed near Nunchuck, crushing several blossoms under his boots.
My flowers!
Aerith yelled.
Stop that!
She ran forward, swinging her staff at the bandana man's head, trying to get him back and out of her precious garden. He ducked the swing, and the second man who'd followed her grabbed her by her loose hair and yanked her back and away. Cloud took a step forward, violence on his mind, but was driven back a step as the woman imposed herself between them.
Shears, Buhito, take care of the Turks and get the ancient out of here. I'll hold this one off.
Narrowing his eyes, Cloud flicked his gaze over at Nunchuck, who'd gotten unsteadily to his feet. He still managed to have both his weapons spinning in a defensive whirl in front of him, but he looked to be in no shape to take on one of the men, let alone both. Twisting forward under another swing from the woman, Cloud popped out a materia from his wrist bracer.
Aerith!
She'd recovered her footing after her rough handling and turned at the sound of her name. He tossed the materia to her, but couldn't see if she caught it before the woman was back on him, pressing her attack. Her desperation was beginning to show as he blocked her, though he wasn't quite sure how to end the stalemate. A ripple of magic went through the room, making the air waver. It was followed by a distortion of sound and the tense, tight feeling of gravity turning on its head. A schism formed that appeared to suck in the light around it, guided by Aerith's hand. The spell picked the man up and out of the flower bed and pinned him to the wall. Cloud let a smug grin spread across his face as he stared the other woman down. Pleased Aerith had managed to get the materia on time. Her natural talent at magic leveled the field against the stronger attackers. To his surprise, a second gravity spell whirled into being, sucking the second man into a prison of force against the opposite wall. Aerith's brow was scrunched up in concentration, with each arm stretched out at an attacker, the materia glowing brightly in one fist. Cloud almost missed it when the avalanche woman wavered in her stance. He'd been too focused on Aerith's fight. Instead of pressing forward to keep Cloud from going to Aerith's aid, the woman dropped to one knee, sword point skittering against the wooden floor.
Elfie!
The bandana-wearing man, Shears, yelled. He redoubled his efforts to escape the pull of the gravity spell holding him in place. With a roar of effort, he managed to wrench himself away from the wall, fighting every step as he moved further from the center of the spell. Once he reached the limit of its influence, he suddenly stumbled forward, freed from its pull. By now, Nunchuck had retreated to the edge of the flower bed, and he tried to intercept Shears' escape. Shears avoided the whirl of wood aimed at his head, scrambling to interpose himself between Cloud and Elfie. Cloud made no move to press the attack. Aerith had let go of the one spell when Shears broke free, and the other one was widening quickly as she lost hold on it. What was most important right now was her safety. Cloud gave the two avalanche members a wide berth as he hurried to her side. The other man, Fujito he supposed, shook off the last of the effects of the gravity spell as Aerith swayed backwards, releasing the magic completely. Cloud put a hand on the small of her back to steady her, and used his foot to kick her staff back into the air. He slipped his hand from her, just in time to catch the weapon, then gently pressed it into her hands. He needn't have worried. Fujito gave the pair a long, off-putting look, then rushed over to Elfie and Shia's side. Nunchuck watched him pass, but made no move to stop him, despite Fujito passing close enough to be in range of his weapon. Cloud was glad for that. The sooner they left, the better.
Why don't we stop here for today?
Fujito murmured. He was eerily unruffled by his part in the fight.
Elfie's pushed herself too far,
Shia said, kneeling down beside her.
Come on, let's get out of here. I'm all right.
Elfie waved him off, pushing herself to her feet.
It's just the usual.
Without another word, she turned her back on them and headed towards the empty doorway. Shias followed her immediately, but Fujito lingered.
I hope you will consider what we said, Miss Aerith,
he said.
Good evening. I already told you my answer,
Aerith called after their retreating backs. Once he was certain the trio was well and truly gone, Cloud sheathed his sword and gently turned Aerith to face him. She still had that crease of anger between her brow, but the effect was ruined by the black blotch on one cheek. That had happened because Cloud hadn't been there to protect her, even if there was no way he could have known, even though he'd made it on time to prevent something worse from happening. It always seemed like he arrived just a bit too late.
Oh, wipe that frown off your face. It doesn't hurt much.
Aerith chided him, as if reading his mind. He huffed at her, then dug into his pocket, pulling out Holy and the pink ribbon. He held them up.
You dropped this.
Oh! Her delighted exclamation was echoed by the wide, relieved smile that spread across her face. She winced as it pulled at her sore cheek, but it didn't stop her joy.
You found my mother's memento! And the ribbon! Cloud, thank you!
Humming quietly in the back of his throat, he reached around her head to gather her hair back into its usual ponytail, looping Holy carefully into the ribbon. He paused when she pried her cure materia out of her staff and held it up.
This one too?
He shook his head and finished setting Holy and the ribbon back in place.
You should use that one, not hide it away.
Leaning back on his heels, he lifted one of her hands in his.
Are you sure you're okay?
She nodded in reassurance, her face a mix of pride and elation.
I'm sure.
She squeezed his hand gently in hers.
Well, I guess I just can't compete.
Nunchuck's cheerful voice broke into their quiet moment. Beaming at them despite his ruffled appearance, Nunchuck looped his weapons around his neck, holding onto either end as he regarded them. The soft tap of shoes near the entrance drew their attention. Tseng stood in the doorway with his hands clasped behind his back. His steps were sure despite the gloom, though he blinked against the dark interior of the church.
What happened here?
Cloud wasn't sure if he should step between the Turk and Aerith, or if Tseng was there because of the threat of avalanche. Nunchuck had been helpful, but from what Cloud could tell, he didn't know of Tseng's mission to watch and possibly capture Aerith. Aerith took a step back, her fingers tightening around her staff and her lips pressing into a thin line.
Oh, hello, Tseng,
Nunchuck said, stepping forward, as if this were an every-night affair.
Are you taking an off-duty stroll as well? Nunchuck?
Tseng asked, sounding surprised. Cloud didn't relax. Whatever Nunchuck said, Tseng was down here for his own reasons. If it came down to breaking his cover to protect Aerith from the Turks, Cloud doubted Zack would begrudge him. Zack, where are you? As if his thoughts had summoned him, there was a commotion outside and Zack came barreling through the doorway with a manic look in his eyes. Buster's sword was in hand, and he was panting hard, as if he'd run all the way from the top of the plate. Idly, Cloud wondered if Zack had even bothered with the train, or if he'd just jumped off the edge. Zack's eyes landed on Aerith, and he dropped Buster's sword with a loud clang before moving towards her.
Aerith, are you all right?
Her reply was muffled, as he didn't wait for her answer, pulling her into a tight hug against his chest.
Cloud sent me a message saying there was trouble. I was so worried.
He drew back, his expression clouding over the moment he saw the bruise blooming on her cheek. He hissed faintly, his fingertips rising to hover over it. Aerith smiled up at him, her hand coming up to grip his.
You should see the other guy,
she said. Zack barked a rough laugh. Nunchuck stepped closer to Tseng, sliding his weapon from his shoulder to tuck under his arm.
Avalanche was destroying this young lady's flowers,
he told Tseng.
I took care of it with Cloud's help. So, do I get a bonus check? I see,
Tseng murmured, his gaze flicking between the four of them. He nodded at Aerith.
In that case, you should return home.
Cloud narrowed his eyes in irritation.
We'll escort Aerith home, after you leave.
He wasn't going to risk being stabbed in the back right now, not with how tense he still was. That fight with Elfé had been so strange. Tseng shot a look towards Zack, and whatever he saw there kept him from commenting on Cloud's less than respectful demand.
I'm aware she's in capable hands. Nunchuck, if you would, we can discuss that bonus.
With a final nod, Tseng turned and made his way out. Nunchuck hung back, looking between Cloud, Zack, and Aerith.
Well, guess I'll see you.
He lifted his hand and waved at them before turning and following after Tseng. Cloud strained to hear, listening to the quiet sound of the Turk's footsteps fading away outside. He was certain that Zack was listening for the same thing, and even when they died completely, they remained silent for several long minutes. Finally, Zack expelled a breath. His voice was low as he asked,
What the hell happened? Avalanche was here? They were after Aerith,
Cloud said quietly.
They were searching Sector 5. They didn't attack your mother, did they?
He asked belatedly, turning a worried look on Aerith. Aerith shook her head, her hair and ribbon bouncing.
No, they chased us.
Zack twisted around to look at Cloud.
You didn't think to include that in your message?
I was more worried about making sure she was safe, Cloud said sharply.
I was a little busy. Aerith's in trouble isn't exactly helpful. It could have been anything. Monsters, Shinra, or Turks, two of which were here.
Zack threw his hands into the air. Cloud bristled.
Next time I'll stop and make a detailed report, sir. Don't use that tone on me, Cloud.
Then stop being such an ass. You probably wouldn't have remembered to text at all.
No, I would have called.
And brought every Avalanche member down on my head? Good plan.
Like your plans are any better.
Zack dragged in a deep breath and ran his hands through his hair.
What did they want with her? I'm right here, you know,
Aerith said, sounding testy. Zack startled and turned a guilty look on Aerith.
Sorry. Are you sure you're all right?
He looked over the damage in the church, frowning.
It looks like things got rough.
I'm fine, she said curtly, her eyes narrowed, switching from Zack to Cloud and back again. You two were expecting trouble, weren't you? Aerith's heart sank as she watched Cloud shift in place. The side of her face ached, and her arms were still twitching from the tingling dregs of magic. But none of her weariness hurt as much as her heart did at the ice-cold realization that ran down her spine. From beside Cloud, Zack gave her a positively wretched look. She just knew. "You already know, don't you?" she asked, voice gone quiet and cool. "You know they were after me because I'm an ancient." "Aerith, Zack said, trailing off when she glared at him. Her mouth trembled, hurt, and anger squeezing her heart. Why have they? She firmed her expression and drew herself up to her full height. "How long have you known?" she demanded. Zack didn't answer immediately, his helpless gaze snapping over to Cloud. "Since the beginning? Is that why?" It hurt to ask around the lump in her throat. "Just one date. Did you know when you asked me?" She was terrified it would turn out to be true, that she'd been drawn in and...
"What?"
Zack yelped, holding his hands up.
"No way! Come on, you know that!"
"Do I?" Aerith hissed, wringing her staff with her hands. "You've said it yourself, that you're keeping a dangerous secret."
"That doesn't have anything to do with this."
"Then what does it have to do with Zack?" Zack scrubbed at his hair in frustration.
Not this. If you think..."
He stopped, his words choking off.
"It's something completely different, that's all."
"If I think what? That you clearly don't trust me enough to let me in on this danger that might affect me? That you said you'd tell me about it eventually, so I'd be ready for it?"
"No, yes, I mean... Damn it."
He hissed a breath out between his teeth.
"Of course I trust you, more than anything. But if you think tonight was bad, you got hurt. This is so much worse."
She felt the sting of that accusation, the calluses on her hands rough against her staff. "I can take care of myself. I've been working hard so that I can."
"Aerith."
She jabbed a finger at him. "No, Zack, I want the truth. What do you know? How long have you known about me? Who told you?"
"Cloud told me,"
he blurted out. The echoes of Zack's voice bounced off the high ceiling of the church, rebounding back for a few seconds before dying away. In the ensuing silence, Aerith sucked in a sharp breath, turning her furious gaze on Cloud. "How long have you been in on this?" she asked. She remembered his words to Avalanche, how sure he'd sounded when he condemned their desire for the Promised Land. She'd hoped it had been her imagination, that he'd merely sounded like he knew more than he possibly could. But here was the proof. Cloud's face was expressionless, his posture completely still. He looked wound tight enough to break. In contrast, his eyes were wild and wide, and whispering to her of secrets that were just out of reach. She tore her gaze away, focusing back on Zack. "How does he know, Zack?" she asked quietly. Zack shifted, eyes flicking guiltily towards Cloud, before saying,
He's from the future."
It sounded more like a question than the ridiculous pronouncement it was. He sent an agonizingly pleading look of apology towards Cloud, before focusing back on Aerith. The three of them stood there, polarized by Zack's stumbling announcement. To Aerith, it felt as if the very air had been sucked out of the church, leaving it still and empty in a way she was unused to. Her chest went tight, and her skin cold as a whisper of something came to her. Slowly, she turned to look at Cloud once more. When her eyes met his, that something seemed to rise up, old and slow and docile. There was a rightness that slapped into place in her head and heart. "Oh," she breathed, and with the sound the air rushed back into her lungs and into the church like a tidal wave. With it came the return of her temper, hot and furious and prickling with unshed tears at the corner of her eyes. That's it? That's why you feel... That's why you're different. Cloud flinched, but didn't say anything. Aerith would have felt bad if she wasn't so mad. How much do you know about me?
Aerith,
Zack said softly. The floorboards creaked as he took a step forward. But she was in no mood to be soothed. You stay over there, she bit out. I'm still mad at you. Zack held up his hands in defeat and subsided.
All right.
It felt like her skin was on fire, and she knew her face was flushed red in anger, embarrassment, and to her shame, a touch of fear. Still, she waited without saying anything more, staring down Cloud's silence. She knew him too well. When he was stressed, he would clam up. She knew she just needed to wait him out. It just scared her what he might say. After what seemed like an eternity, Cloud finally spoke.
I don't know as much as you think.
His gaze went distant, and she got the distinct feeling he was no longer looking at her.
What I know is possibilities. Just what happened once. Not now, not you. The Aerith I knew.
He paused, then shook his head.
No, that doesn't matter right now. I know facts because of it. But what I know about you is what we experienced together. That's what matters.
The tightness in Aerith's chest eased, and her expression softened. It was true. She'd been thinking it moments before, about how well she knew him. Zack, too. Truthfully, she didn't think he was tricking her for Shinra's gain. I still want to know, she said firmly. I need to know what's going on. Slowly, he nodded.
Zack was right. Do you remember when he called you on that Medial assignment and had you talk to me?
Yes, she said. Cloud had sounded like he knew her then, hadn't he? Was that when... He ran a hand through his hair as he nodded.
I had already caused a problem then, and Zack, he dragged him out of a pool of Mako.
Zack cut in. His voice was uncharacteristically quiet, quelled from the tension in the air. When Aerith looked at him, he didn't meet her eyes. Of course, she murmured. The live stream... She cut herself off, then remembered that there was no reason to hide anymore. Still, there was one thing she didn't understand. Why?
What?
Cloud asked, startled. Why were you sent back? Aerith clarified. She could understand somewhat what must have happened. The planet whispered to her, often incomprehensibly, but she knew the vast power of its consciousness. That didn't tell her why it had picked Cloud, or why he had been sent to now. The planet didn't think like she did. She doubted anyone thought the way the planet did. It just was, existing and continuing and echoing within itself. Cloud looked baffled and exchanged a confused look with Zack.
I don't know,
he confessed.
I never thought about it. I assumed it had to do with...
He trailed off.
Sephiroth,
Zack said, with a shake of his head.
He's not going to appear just because you said his name.
Cloud rolled his eyes.
Shut up, Zack.
Sephiroth? Aerith asked. What does he have to do with this? When Zack and Cloud looked at each other again, she felt her ire return. That has to stop! She gestured between the two of them. Stop acting like I'm not involved! Zack refused to look up from his feet, and Cloud had gone stone-faced again. She didn't want to be angry at them, but they were still keeping their secrets. If they didn't tell her anything now, she didn't know what she'd do. In the ensuing silence, she hugged her arms to herself, warding off the chill that wasn't entirely physical. Normally her church was warm, full of light and life, her sanctuary. With the cold air wafting in from the destroyed doorway and the sad, crushed blossoms laying in her garden, she no longer felt as safe. When Cloud began talking, it took her a numb moment to turn her attention to him.
"I was never anything important to Shinra,"
he said quietly. He caught her eyes, thumbing at his scarf.
"I was just a trooper who failed to get into soldier. Not this."
She straightened, letting her arms fall to her side as she realized he was finally going to tell her. All this time, she thought it was a secret of Zack's, that he'd eventually come to her and explain what was so dangerous. Not Cloud. Maybe that was why it had gone on this long.
"There was a mission to Nibelheim,"
Cloud continued.
"Sephiroth and Zack were sent out with a handful of troopers. I was one of them. I didn't know anything about Sephiroth then. Nothing important, at least. He was the strongest soldier, someone I looked up to, wanted to be. So when he vanished for a few days, I didn't know what to think."
Dread built in Aerith's heart, though she didn't know why. She had asked, though, and it was difficult for him to share this. In respect to that, she kept quiet as she listened.
Zack, the Zack from then, found him in a hidden Shinra library, reading books planted there by Hojo.
She couldn't stop her gasp of surprise. Hojo was the last person she thought would be part of this. For all he'd hounded her all her life, he was her personal demon. Cloud seemed to understand. He tilted his head in acknowledgement as he continued.
Sephiroth came to think that a creature called Genova was his mother, that Genova was an ancient.
Her knees felt weak. She let herself sink into the nearest pew, the wood warm and steadying under her palm. It wasn't the mention of the ancients that had gotten to her. It was the pounding pressure and fear that came screaming through her from the planet at the mention of Genova. She had no idea what it was, yet it still filled her with dread, so strong she wanted to cry. She wouldn't let herself. Instead, she let her own anger bolster her, pushing away at the intrusive feeling of the planet. Cloud had paused in his story when she moved. When she looked up at him, she had to hold back a wince at the distant, detached look in his eyes. As soon as he saw that he had her attention, he continued.
"All soldiers have Genova cells in them, but Sephiroth's connection is stronger."
"What?" she breathed. She tore her eyes away to look at Zack. Nausea rolled in her stomach at the thought, and her head spun in confusion and horror. She hated that she didn't know why, but the planet was surging through her, and a feeling of calamity and wrongness came with it. How could any of them stand it? She felt like she wanted to claw her own skin off at the thought. Cloud ignored her.
It allowed Genova to reach him. Whatever Genova is, it was still aware enough, alive enough to call him to her. The reunion."
This time the pause was on his account, his gaze staring off into the distance.
"Sephiroth destroyed Nibelheim. Zack couldn't stop him. I did."
The explanation was sorely lacking in details, but Aerith wasn't brave enough to ask for more. Wasn't Cloud from Nibelheim? She glanced at his blank expression and shuddered.
"Afterwards, Sephiroth fell into the reactor with a piece of Genova, and Hojo took Zack and I for 5 years.
"Stop!" she pleaded quietly, involuntarily. She could barely talk around the lump in her throat. She didn't want to hear this, even with Zack and him right here in front of her. She didn't want to imagine what horrors Hojo could inflict. Memories rose up, silencing the noise of the planet. It wasn't a relief. In her mind she could see Alfana's tired and sad face, framed by the cobbles of the train station as she pleaded with Elmira to take care of my child. Alfana had sacrificed a lot to keep Aerith away from Hojo. He was her childhood boogeyman, full of dark terror she refused to dwell on. Cloud didn't stop, though. I was a better subject for his experiments, with Genova cells and Sephiroth. He was trying to make another Sephiroth, a clone, and I was a failed specimen. When Zack got us out, I was too far gone from the Mako poisoning to realize much of what happened. But sometimes I could tell. When he died... "Stop!" she cried, clapping her hands to her ears. Cloud's mouth snapped shut, and she took no joy in that. Tears were prickling at her eyes. She didn't want to know such horrible things. She didn't want to imagine a world without Zack. A floorboard creaked as Zack took an abortive step forward. He didn't come and comfort her, though. She wished he would. Mad as she was, all she wanted right now was to be tight in his embrace, feeling the life flowing through him. You wanted to know. Even through the hands covering her ears, she heard Cloud's quiet voice. Hot anger flushed in her chest. Maybe she had, but he was being so cruel about it, so cold. It was unfair of her to think so. He had lived through it, after all. But it still hurt, twisting her gut painfully as tears welled in her eyes. She tried to take a deep breath, but it caught halfway through in a sob. She bit her lip to keep the sound from escaping. After a few more tries, she managed to suck in a full breath, then another, until she got her nerves steady. Her hands shook when she let them drop in her lap. She clenched them tightly, twisting the cloth in her dress hard enough to pull at the seams. She didn't dare look at Cloud's face. "What happened then?" she said thickly. Thankfully, Cloud didn't linger on that part of the story. I somehow made it to Midgar. Tifa found me, and... Cloud trailed off. He was staring down at one hand, absently clenching and unclenching his fist. Part of Genova cells' properties are their ability to take on traits from others. I was able to reconstruct myself using Tifa's memories of me, and Zack's experience. I couldn't live as myself, so I tried to live as him. Aerith felt tears of sympathy stinging her eyes. There were times in the past when Cloud had reminded her of Zack. Times when she saw so much of Zack in him. She thought it was just the close nature of their friendship. She risked another look at Zack. He looked sad, angry, and she wondered why. Didn't he already know all this? Or, she amended her thoughts as she looked back at Cloud, was Cloud as evasive with Zack as he was to her? For a while, I continued like that. I had joined some friends of Tifa. They were just people who wanted to save the planet from Shinra. A lot happened, but along the way we discovered Sephiroth had come back, that he was searching for the black materia. A feeling of fear, so intense, deep and old, welled up within her. It was so overwhelming that Aerith couldn't separate it from herself for a moment. When it receded, leaching out of her like the tide, she felt only confusion. Why had the planet reacted so loudly, so suddenly? She'd never heard it so clearly before, not even in response to Genova. What was it about this black materia that left her feeling cold and scared? Only as she straightened up did she realize she curled in on herself. She became aware of a warm weight on her shoulder and the sound of Cloud's voice as he continued to speak. Aerith shrugged her shoulder out from Zack's hand and straightened her spine resolutely. She had so many questions, wanted to know much more than Cloud would, or maybe could, give her, even if it scared her. How could she possibly go on after this? What was she supposed to do? All we could do was race to catch up. Every time we thought we were a step ahead, he already knew. Aerith squeezed her eyes shut. Of course, it was only a matter of time before he got to her part in the story. She didn't feel ready, but Cloud didn't pause. Was able to learn from the planet secrets only she understood as an ancient. She didn't tell us, but went off on her own to the ancient's capital city. When we got there, Cloud's jaw snapped shut tight. His face screwed up in remembered pain. The haunted look in his eyes was the worst she'd ever seen. He didn't look like he was here anymore, that he couldn't see the church around them, or her seated nearby. Numbly, Aerith wondered what sort of trial this other her had gone through. Nothing she knew, even with the whispers of the planet, spoke to her that deeply. What had her other self discovered? Now that Cloud was here, would she ever learn? Cloud went on, voice rough. Aerith was praying. She was trying to save. His hand came up to tangle in his hair. Fist tight.
Sephiroth was in my head, forcing me to move. I had my sword, and he was telling me to do it, and I was going to.
Zack inhaled sharply.
Cloud,
he said, sounding pained.
You don't have to.
Cloud cut him off. I was supposed to kill Aerith. Aerith curled her arms around herself. She hadn't thought she could feel worse than she already did. With the anger and hurt and how sickening everything was. But the cold fear that dripped down her spine belied that thought. The thought of Zack's death crushed her world. The thought of her own was too much. There was too much information, too much to take in. Had Cloud gone through with it? Did she want to know? She wanted to tell Cloud to stop again, but she knew if she did, she would never hear the full story. Zack was too disheartened to stop this, and Cloud would only clam up and be impossible later if he didn't get it all out at once. She didn't think she could handle asking again either. Cloud looked drained, as if that confession had taken all of his energy. His hand dropped to his side, and he half turned away from them. We followed Sephiroth to the northern crater. There I came back to myself. No. He corrected himself. I was forced to face what I really was. That I wasn't who I thought I was. In my confusion, I was weak, and I gave the black materia to Sephiroth. He summoned Meteor, and Aerith activated Holy before she was killed. Aerith's hand rose involuntarily to her hair, where the ribbon held her mother's memento in place. Somehow she knew that it was one and the same as the holy Cloud was talking about. So had he known when he found it, what it could do? She had thought it was a material that didn't work. Such power, and she still had no idea how to use it. The frustration of it choked her. Holy wasn't enough, but the life stream came to the surface to protect the planet. What could possibly be so terrible that the planet itself would react? Aerith was only able to hear bits of the planet's thoughts, incomprehensible and ancient. It was larger than anything, larger than everything. It was slow and ponderous, willing and able to wait for centuries to fix wounds done to it. She had no say over it, couldn't bend it to her will. Was Meteor so terrible that it would destroy the planet? The thought terrified her. It saved us from Meteor. We found out though, that it gave Sephiroth another chance to take the planet as his. Life stream touched by Genova is corrupted, and when that corruption enters a human body, it infects it with a disease. Many people were infected and susceptible, as I had been, to Sephiroth's suggestion. He used the final piece of Genova to manifest himself. Sephiroth, Sephiroth! She was so sick of hearing that name. All it seemed to bring was pain for her, for Cloud, and for the planet. Her head hurt, but not as much as her heart. She didn't understand half of what Cloud was saying now. She just wanted it to be over. I was able to defeat him. Aerith looked up slowly. Cloud's tone had varied from monotonous to full of pain. But this was different. Lighter somehow. And Aerith was able to reach out again from the life stream to cure those that had been infected. Silence fell over the church as Cloud's story came to an end. Aerith wanted so much to be skeptical of the entire thing, to imagine that Cloud was making it up for some reason, but she was unable to. A normal person would find such fantasy impossible to believe. She wasn't normal, though. She was an ancient, and it had never sat so bitterly before. Zack fidgeted beside her, never one to sit still for long. She ignored him, staring blankly at her flowers, taking comfort in their bright colours. The gloom had lifted, the first rays of sunlight shining down through the broken ceiling with the soft light of dawn. She felt brittle. The planet was so loud right now, reacting strongly to Cloud's words. She'd never felt such a thing, and that disturbed her as well. Who was Cloud to be so important to the planet, that really cared about the small lives it nurtured? It was Zack who broke the silence. Of course it was Zack. Aerith, he said, stepping around and squatting down in front of her. His face was open and sympathetic. It still reminded her of a kicked puppy, with the way his brows were lifted in worry and his mouth stretched down in a frown. She hated that look on his face, hated him and Cloud for keeping all of this from her, hated that they had shared it now, hated herself for being upset. "No," she said, shaking her head. "I can't do this right now. I need time to think." And maybe to cry. She pushed herself to her feet, avoiding Zack's grasping hand, didn't look as she passed by Cloud, and exited the church. Singh led the way through Sector 5 and back towards Sector 6 before cutting off into the slums. He kept his peace, though his shoulders were tense and back ramrod straight. He hadn't a chance to talk to Aerith and try to persuade her, let alone carry out his orders to collect her. It didn't matter that he'd had no plan to follow through. Singh had long ago come to the conclusion that gaining her willing cooperation was paramount. He'd been banking on how late it was, that she would be home, and he wouldn't even run across her. Then he could report truthfully that he'd not located her that night. Now it was growing to be late enough that the slums were a little quieter. The few who were out and about were those scrounging for a living when the rest of the population slept. Thugs, thieves, drunks, and the occasional reveller. The slums were seedy enough in the day, but in the depths of night, the dark underbelly of Midgar came to full life. "What's the story?" Nunchok asked casually. His tone could have been inquiring about the weather, rather than the tableau Singh had just come across. "I believe," Singh murmured, leading the way towards Wall Market. "That is my question." He was certain at the very least Rude and Reno would still be at the bar. Nunchuck knew better than to ask right then. For all his cheerful nature, he was a patient man. Singh would go so far as to say that that was part of what made him one of their more deceitful agents.
The door to the bar was propped open with a cinder block. Tseng ducked inside, scanning the dimly lit interior for his subordinates. Renault's shock of wild red hair caught his eye. They'd relocated from the bar to a table in one of the darker corners. Rude sat with his back to the wall, long legs stretched over the bench seat, while Renault slumped across the table, nursing his drink. Tseng moved between the tables, with their wildly varied seats towards them. As he approached, Rude sat up a little straighter and moved his legs. Renault turned his head just enough to peer back over his shoulder. Without a word, Tseng rounded the table and slid into the seat beside Rude. Nunchuck dragged a chair over to join them. "No luck?" Renault asked, snide voice undercut by the faintest slur of intoxication. His smirk was as razor-sharp as ever. "I ran into a bit of interference," Tseng replied, flagging down the waitress. The slums didn't have his preferred drink of brandy del Sol. He was lucky if the bars down here stocked brandy at all. This was one of the few that had a passable stock. "Oh, yeah?" Renault asked, straightening up in his seat while Tseng gave his order to the waitress. Renault's attention turned to Nunchuck, and he gave him a once-over. "You look like you've been through the grinder." Nunchuck turned his chair around and sat down, straddling it. "It was a busy night." "Day off?" Rude asked. "Yes, though it felt like an average day on the job," Nunchuck replied. Before she left, he offered his own order to the waitress. Tseng gazed out over the patronage, eyes on the middle distance. He inhaled the scents of tobacco and alcohol, overlaying the grittier, slightly oily scent of the slums. His fingers tapped at the table as he waited. The waitress returned, setting the snifter of brandy down before him on the scarred table. Nunchuck took his bottle straight from her with a smile. "Anything else I can get you?" she asked. Renault waved her away and sat up straighter before scooting his chair closer to the table. Only once the waitress was busy taking orders across the room did he lean in and ask, "What the hell went down?" Tseng lifted his drink and gazed at Nunchuck over the rim. "Again, my question." Nunchuck rolled his bottle between his hands, the liquid sloshing around inside. "Avalanche showed up in Sector 5 slums." His wide blue eyes turned on Tseng. "They were after Miss Aerith, and they called her an ancient?" "Ah," Tseng murmured. That cleared up one question, though it did bring to light some issues. Avalanche was after the ancient as well, and knew where to find her. Troubling, and it doesn't bode well for my attempts to coax her back slowly. And then there was the look on Zack's face. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt a chill like that go down his spine. It was so easy to forget that Zack Fair was a very, very dangerous man. "We have several potential problems stemming from this. Not the least of which was that he now had to debrief Nunchuck on the issue of the ancient." "I'd say," Renault groused, his fingers wrapping around the edge of his glass. He tilted it and peered down into its contents. Tseng suspected whiskey. Slanting a glance at Nunchuck, Tseng asked, "What happened to the doors?" "Cloud kicked them in." Slowly taking a sip from his drink, Tseng considered this. Cloud's strength came as little surprise to him, though it was still concerning. The doors were large, heavy affairs, and he'd not only kicked them clean off their hinges, but several feet into the church. Thinking back on the way they'd closed ranks around Aerith when he'd approached, Tseng felt that chill again. He ran his tongue over the backs of his teeth, tasting the brandy. A chill of premonition, perhaps. Renault often said that he had a feeling about things, but Tseng rarely put stock in such thinking. Maybe he should start. They had their orders, and there wasn't much to do about changing them, but he ought to suggest they work to mitigate possible dangers. He looked into the snifter he cradled and breathed out a faint sigh. "I had hoped that Zack's relationship with Aerith would tie her closer to Shinra, but I'm worried it may be doing the opposite." Across from him, Renault ran his fingers around the rim of his glass. You starting to question Fair's loyalties more?
Perhaps, Tsing murmured, hiding his expression behind his drink again.
Wait,
Nunchuck said, pointing a finger at Reno.
Zack and Aerith? You sure it's not Cloud?
Reno laughed, then choked on his drink.
Wait until Sephiroth hears that,
he said through his choking. Nunchuck's eyes widened comically.
I have missed a lot, haven't I?
Reno, Rude and Tseng said in unison.
Yeah,
Reno muttered, taking another drink. Silence fell between them, the only sound coming from the scrape of Nunchuck picking the label off his beer, and the ambient rumble of talk in the room at large. Tseng let his attention wander over the variety of papers and notes plastered on the wall of the bar. Shinra propaganda stared back at him, interspersed with photos and advertisements. Clearing his throat, he offered,
Cloud was hostile as well.
Reno grunted, opening his mouth, and was cut off by the sound of Nunchuck's label tearing. Nunchuck looked up and said,
They just had a scare, you realize.
He smiled, disarming and warm. He was good at that, and Tseng inclined his head in acknowledgement of the logic. Reno snorted.
There's a lot more there than you know about, rookie.
Perhaps, Nunchuck said, tearing the label on his beer further.
But anyone with eyes can see that Cloud and Zack are very fond of her.
The real question was whether or not Zack and Cloud knew about Shinra's interest in Aerith, and if their fondness for her outweighed their loyalty to the company. Had Aerith told Zack about her heritage? He'd once had a conversation with Zack about it, about how he should speak to Aerith if he really wanted to know. Had he? Had she told him that Tseng had tried to take her in, and was that the reason for Zack's dark, protective look? Had they, in turn, brought Cloud in on the secret, or was he simply continuing to act as an anomaly? There was something to be said for Zack, to have tossed aside Buster's sword as easily as he did when he arrived. Everyone knew what that sword meant to Zack Fair. Tseng had been there, in the direct aftermath of its acquisition. He knew better than most. Whether or not their motives were entirely personal, or came from underlying conspiracy, the point remained. They had proven themselves dangerous. Nunchuck shifted, and the creaking of his chair drew Tseng's attention.
What is the story with Cloud, anyway? He's clearly no regular trooper. But the uniform... He took on Elfie.
Reno snorted.
You've been out in the boonies chasing Avalanche too long.
He took a long sip from his glass, nearly emptying it. The remnants swirled in the bottom, a thin puddle of amber liquid.
Cloud Strife is Shinra's newest prodigy.
And if he could stand against a woman who had purportedly blocked Sephiroth's attack, he had once more proven himself to be on the same level as a man oft viewed as untouchable.
He's not a soldier yet. The science department badly wants to study him. The soldier program badly wants him in it. And the president wants his power secured as his. From what we know, he can hold his own against Sephiroth.
Nunchuck went still, his grip tightening on his bottle. Then he brought it up and took a deep gulp from it. Reno's smirk was a nasty slash of his mouth in his amusement, and Tseng swallowed a chuckle. Rude leaned over and patted Nunchuck on the back. Tseng didn't miss the way he winced at the contact.
You all right?
Rude asked. Clearly he had noticed as well. Nunchuck waved the question away.
A little bruised. I'll be fine. I had a run-in with Shears. Twice. Nothing a little rest and relaxation won't fix. Make sure you take a trip to medical.
Tseng said. It wouldn't do for one of them to be out of commission when there was so much at stake. They needed all the manpower they could get between Avalanche, general unrest, and now the issue of their rising soldier stars. Nunchuck ducked his head in a quick nod, recognizing an order when he heard it.
One thing, boss, Nunchuck said. I'm getting the feeling that this Cloud business is our business. He said something that I found odd. Singh raised an eyebrow when Nunchuck hesitated. He got kind of mouthy when he was fighting Elfei. It rather seemed like... He trailed off, staring absently at the bottle in his hand. "Spit it out already!" Renu barked. Across the bar, a few heads turned towards them. Blinking, Nunchuck smiled at Renu and nodded. Of course. It's rather speculative, and I might have missed something as I was preoccupied at the time, but it does seem that Cloud is certain that Avalanche is going to fail." Renu smashed his fist against the table violently, causing Nunchuck to jump. "Fucking hell! Why won't that little shit make sense?" Rude snorted. "You're just upset that you bet on him being Avalanche in the office pool." "Damn right I am," Renu snapped. "Right," Singh said wearily. "Nunchuck, give Renu a full report, and we'll give you that rundown tomorrow." "Yes, sir," Nunchuck said, saluting lazily with his bottle. "I look forward to it." Renu rocked back in his chair, the legs thumping loudly against the floor. He tipped his head back and drained what was left of his glass before dashing his sleeve across his mouth. "The thing I want to know is what we're going to do to put Fair and Strife on a leash." Singh raised a brow, a faint smile touching his mouth. Lifting his glass, he said, "Divide and conquer." Tilting his head back, he drank deeply from his brandy. He set the glass down, dropped a few gil on the table to pay for his drink, and stood. He needed to report to Veld. Renu's sharp laugh followed him out of the bar and into Midgard's night.